All right. So for the uninitiated, those who don't know, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Paul Miller. I'm the Senior VP of Sales at Precision Record Pressing, which is a vinyl record manufacturing plant. We've got a few locations in Southern Ontario, the headquarters being Burlington. So record pressing, all things vinyl, printing, uh, yeah, etc.
So anyone who's listening to this, who's part of punk and hardcore, we're going to be like, well, of course, vinyl. Like, let's
Right.
talk about it.
Right.
Anyone who's from the rest of the business world, I don't want to say isn't into vinyl, but of course, you and I remember like at the end of the 80s, kind of the beginning of the 90s, it seemed like vinyl was going away.
Yeah.
Huge resurgence.
Yeah.
So for you, speaking more to a general audience, why vinyl?
Yeah, it was nothing that I had any sort of insight into as something that would grow over the years. So that was dumb luck. For me, it was, like you, it was punk rock. That's what got me into it, punk and hardcore. Um, there were bands like The Clash where, it would be sort of, vinyl became almost like a jump off point or a jump to point from bands like that who would talk about their influences, and you could find those things on vinyl. So it became like, part of the discovery process of expanding my music taste.
Mm.
So I always really had a soft spot for it. I loved it for that reason. Um, and yeah, I mean, as the years went on, it became more of a viable business, which shocked many people who were involved in vinyl in the dark days of the 80s and 90s when it had a slower pulse.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what got me into it, just the personal love of collecting music and discovering records.
There's something about it, and I think like even if you're not someone who's like super into collecting records, like vinyl records,
Mm-hmm.
there's something about flipping through records at a record store and looking at all the vinyl up on the wall that can't be captured with like CDs or tape or digital or anything like that. There's
Yeah.
just something distinctly different about it.
Yeah.
What do you think is that like? It's like a psychological difference. There's something
Mm.
about it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we're getting out of this, well, I don't know about entirely getting out of it, but let's call it the pandemic era, which is a major sort of touch point for vinyl records because the demand, it had blossomed before that, but it really boomed, over the last couple of years. And when people are stuck inside, right? I think people wanted to turn to something that had that kind of like, tangible sense of, I don't know, like connection with the music that they couldn't get otherwise because we were stuck indoors. And obviously, the pandemic isn't the only thing that sparked further interest in vinyl because the interests have been growing since I would say like the mid 2000s, right? But I think it's that same kind of quality, right? Like you were saying, it's that sort of tangible element to it. Um, I think CDs just became less interesting for a lot of people, right? And that's why digital had an easy time sort of sweeping it away. Even when things like Napster were new, you could get digital music for free, right? And suddenly next to a CD, like that just seemed a lot more accessible and interesting. We've gone quite far in that direction, which I think is a good thing in terms of the streaming services and the accessibility of music in a way that we didn't have access to before. That's obviously great, but it feels like a bit of a tipping point where you go so far in a direction of sort of I guess we could say kind of digital excess that there ends up being a yearning for something more classic and tangible, right? And I feel like that's where vinyl gets its power.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I also that like, that like paradox of choice, right? Where there's like, in many ways, you think the more choice you have, the better. But the more choice you have, it's like the less those things matter in many ways. It's like, oh, I have at this point like hundreds of thousands of records right at my fingertips,
Right.
and like with Spotify and Apple Music and these things. Only the records that I already loved because I had them on vinyl or I was introduced to them as a kid are the ones that are like ultra special to me.
Right.
Because there's like, and it doesn't mean new records aren't like. So for example, there's bands like Chain Whip, which is a great Canadian band, or Gag from the States, and like those, or Mind Force, another band from the States. These are bands who like I would seek out their records now.
Yeah.
But like, unless a band has like a record that I can like hold and like
Mm-hmm.
go through and look at it. It's
Mm-hmm.
got to be
Mm-hmm.
vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't make the same kind of connection. It doesn't mean I don't think the record's cool. It just doesn't go into like the files of my mind as being like, oh, that's like, that really means something to me.
I like that files in my mind because I think about that sorting mechanism based on how much I love a record. And I'm using record in the loose sense of just a collection of songs. Because I'll check something out digitally. This is just my habit. I'm sure it doesn't reflect the general populace here, but if I love something, I have to have it on vinyl because it's like the document of the music for me, right? So I can have a more kind of like ephemeral relationship with music that still has value, right? Like ambient music that maybe I'm just listening to while working that doesn't really grab me, but there might be a project that I think is so good that if I don't have it on vinyl, I feel like I haven't completed that sorting process in my head. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So yeah, I don't know how many people think about records that way, but I think that the tangible element is obviously the thing that propels the most amount of people toward it, I think. I read this statistic in, Illuminate. You ever heard of Illuminate?
Mm-mm.
I can't say for sure exactly. Well, I'm not sure I could, define them as a business very well. They're responsible, from what I understand, for, reporting music industry statistics to places like Billboard, I think. So they have something to do with chart positions. But anyway, Luminate released a study at the end of last year that looked at vinyl consumption amongst different demographics. Demographics more in the genre sense, I guess, like how many people who listen to hip hop are streaming versus vinyl. There was one statistic that I still am thinking about, which is that 50% of people who bought a record in 2022 own a record player. And I wonder about if that, like how relevant that statistic is essentially, because people are buying it either to listen to it or to have it for some other reason. You were talking about records that you cherish. You probably, I don't know how often you specifically listen to them,
Mm-hmm.
but you have an emotional attachment to it.
Totally, man.
So maybe actually like there's no reason to get cranky old school about it, to say, well, the kids these days, they're not listening to records like I listen to. I mean, does it matter, right? Probably not. We don't want to gatekeep. And so anyway, I think that statistic is kind of fun, I mean,
I
people
love
collect records. People collect all kinds of things for all different reasons. It says something about your personality or your, I don't know, your identity, your connection to things.
Totally, because it's gone beyond just being a format of music, because there's so many. Like, think how many people who maybe buy a record and do have a record player, but listen to it a couple times on vinyl, but then they just stream it most of the time. And
Right.
A record they really like. When vinyl was a thing before, it's like you could listen to records on vinyl, and then on vinyl and tape. So like there wasn't streaming, so it was like that was the way you had to listen to it. But the strength of the format is now so much beyond the like sitting down and listening to it. I like what you said. It's like it has so much to do with about your identity, how you connect to things.